What if the first human cities were not built with hope, but with recognition? What if the earliest walls were raised not in excitement, but in quiet familiarity, as if hands already knew where the stones belonged, as if the ground itself was reminding them? The oldest tablets never begin with creation. They do not speak of invention or discovery. They begin after something has already ended. Later scribes would call it the dawn of civilization, but the fragments themselves suggest something else. They describe a long morning after a collapse, a world still wet, still quiet, still uncertain, not a beginning, a return. What the tablets describe is not humanity learning for the first time, but humanity waking with incomplete memory, like someone opening their eyes in a familiar room, unable to remember how they arrived there. The Sumerian scribes never wrote, "This is new." They wrote, "This was given back." Numbers already shaped, measures already agreed upon, laws already old. They carved them slowly, carefully, as if afraid that haste itself might cause another loss. And woven through these early records is a persistent unease, a sense that knowledge is not neutral, that remembering can be dangerous. The king lists reveal this unease more clearly than any myth. Names repeat, dynasties overlap, time stretches beyond the limits of the human body. Kings rule not for decades, but for ages, not metaphorically. The scribes do not soften the numbers. They do not explain them. They simply preserve them, as if accuracy mattered more than believability. Because to alter memory, even memory that feels impossible, would be a greater error. The tablets imply that before the Great Flood, time itself behaved differently, not faster, not slower, but deeper. Lives unfolded without urgency, knowledge accumulated without pressure, and then something changed. The flood, as the fragments describe it, is not sudden. It approaches. It is anticipated. Warnings are given, measurements taken, instructions passed quietly. This is not punishment. This is procedure. Water rises. Cities dissolve. Structures soften, not as an act of anger, but as an erasure, a reset. When the waters finally withdraw, they do not reveal emptiness. They reveal survivors. But these survivors are altered. They remember too much to be innocent, and too little to be wise. They know how to shape clay, but not why the shapes matter. They know where to look, but not what they are meant to see. This is where the watchers appear. Not suddenly, not dramatically. They are already there. The tablets never describe their arrival, only their presence. They are referred to, not as creators, but as those who remain, custodians, observers, record keepers. Later traditions would call them gods. But the fragments resist that simplicity. They behave not like beings of worship, but like administrators, bound by rules, older than humanity, and they disagree. This disagreement is never resolved. Some argue that humanity must be guided, that knowledge should be given slowly, in measured portions. Others believe that withholding knowledge creates instability, that ignorance itself leads to collapse. This quiet conflict echoes through every age that follows, because whenever humanity advances too quickly, something intervenes, not violently, not openly. Progress simply loses coherence. Systems grow complex, but fragile. Understanding outruns wisdom, and collapse follows, not as destruction, but as forgetting. This pattern appears again and again in stories of golden ages, followed by darkness, in myths of ancient teachers who vanish, in legends of lands that sink beneath the sea. Atlantis is one such memory, not a place, a warning encoded as geography. The account preserved later does not celebrate Atlantis. It mourns it, an advanced society, aligned with cycles, balanced between land and water, sky and stone. until balance is lost, not through malice, through excess, too much certainty, too much reach, too little restraint. Atlantis does not explode. It dissolves. It passes beneath the surface, quietly, and what remains is a story, told cautiously, as if speaking too clearly, might invite repetition. This is how ancient memory works. It does not shout. It whispers, and it repeats itself, with variations, across continents, across languages. The same structure appears, a beginning remembered as a return. Teachers who withdraw, knowledge that arrives incomplete. The watchers fade, not because they are defeated, but because involvement has consequences. Humanity must be allowed to struggle, but not too much, to learn, but not too fast. And this balance is never stable. Ancient astronomy preserves this tension. The earliest star charts are precise, shockingly so. Alignments measured over vast spans of time, cycles tracked with patience that suggests generations working toward a single understanding. Then gradually, the precision softens. Stars become symbols, movements become stories, science becomes myth, not because humanity regresses, but because something is being sealed. Dangerous clarity is being buried, and humanity adapts. It always does, living inside limitation, as if it were natural. Every generation believes it stands at the edge of discovery, unaware that the edge has been reached before, and crossed, and erased. This is where the tablets grow quiet again. They do not predict the future. They do not warn explicitly. They simply preserve the pattern. Rise, imbalance, collapse, return, and they leave a question unanswered. If humanity has awakened before, if it has reached too far before, if it has been restrained before, what determines when remembering becomes too dangerous? And who decides when the cycle begins again? The fragments do not say. They only suggest that the cycle is not finished, and that perhaps, even now, we are not moving forward, but approaching a familiar threshold. What the fragments suggest next is not a single event, but a slow divergence, not in humanity, but among the watchers. The tablets never dramatize this. They never frame it as war or rebellion. They describe it the way stone records pressure, without sound, without spectacle, a disagreement that unfolds over ages. Some of the watchers believed that humanity's forgetting was not a failure, but a necessity. They argued that consciousness, awakening too quickly, creates imbalance. That knowledge, without patience, distorts intention. In their view, the flood was not a mistake. It was correction, a way to thin memory, to reduce clarity, to restore rhythm. Others among them disagreed. They observed that forgetting does not bring wisdom. It brings fear, and fear accelerates collapse more reliably than knowledge ever could. They believed humanity needed continuity, a thread of understanding that could survive resets. These opposing views never resolve. They coexist, and the tablets imply that history itself is the result of this tension. Guidance appears, then vanishes. Knowledge arrives, then fragments. Every age receives just enough, never more, never all. This is why early civilizations seem strangely advanced and strangely incomplete. Architecture that understands geometry and alignment, but lacks certain tools. Astronomy that tracks cycles with astonishing accuracy, but does not explain them. Medicine that heals, but does not fully diagnose. As if someone decided how far understanding should go, and no further. The watchers do not rule openly. They influence through absence, through timing, through withdrawal. The tablets describe moments when guidance is present, golden ages, periods of balance, where humanity builds without overreaching. And then, slowly, the guidance fades, not abruptly, almost politely, and humanity continues alone. at first confidently, then with increasing uncertainty. This pattern repeats so consistently that later scribes stop questioning it. They accept it as the way of things, as the nature of time itself. Atlantis appears again here, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a prolonged imbalance. The fragments suggest that Atlantis lasted long enough to forget restraint, long enough to believe stability was permanent. Its alignment with the stars became control over them. Its harmony with the sea became dominance, and dominance always accelerates collapse. What the memory traditions emphasize is not the destruction, but the silence beforehand, a moment when guidance ceased, when warnings were no longer given, not as punishment, but as experiment. Could humanity regulate itself? Could it stop before excess? The answer, according to the fragments, was no. And so Atlantis passed beneath the water, not erased violently, but removed, contained, as if to prevent its memory from spreading too clearly. What survives is distortion, a story told by outsiders, a warning softened by distance. The same process occurs elsewhere, in lands that never knew Atlantis by name. The same pattern emerges independently. Civilizations rise near water. They align with the sky. They organize time. They reach a peak of certainty. Then something changes. Climate shifts. Resources strain. Social structures harden. And collapse follows, always leaving behind structures that feel slightly out of place, too precise, too early. Modern observers call this mystery. The fragments call it repetition. Ancient astronomy is where the disagreement becomes most visible. Early sky records track precession, a cycle so long it requires many generations to observe fully. And yet, the cycle is recorded, not estimated. Recorded. This implies continuity beyond a single civilization. Knowledge passed through collapse, preserved indirectly, hidden in myth, encoded in ritual. The watchers who favored restraint allowed this. They believed some knowledge could remain, as long as it could not be weaponized, as long as it required patience. Those who favored guidance pushed for clarity, for explanation, for teaching. And here, the balance tilts. Because teaching accelerates understanding, and acceleration has consequences. The tablets hint that this disagreement is the reason for inconsistent guidance. Why some cultures receive teachers and others do not. Why some knowledge appears fully formed, while other insights are rediscovered painfully. The watchers are not omnipotent. They are constrained by rules older than themselves, rules that prioritize long-term stability over short-term flourishing. Human suffering is not ignored, but it is tolerated as part of a larger cycle. This is not cruelty. It is detachment, and detachment is often mistaken for indifference. Humanity responds, as it always does, by mythologizing absence, by turning former guidance into divine authority, by worshiping what was once instruction. This transformation changes everything, because worship ends questioning, and questioning is how memory survives. The fragments note that when humans begin to pray rather than ask, decline accelerates. Knowledge becomes sacred, untouchable, and therefore unusable. This is when cycles shorten. Civilizations rise and fall more quickly. Lessons are forgotten before they can mature. The watchers observe. They intervene less, not because they care less, but because interference creates dependency, and dependency creates fragility. So humanity is left to rediscover again and again, each time believing it is the first. Modern humanity sits inside this same pattern. The fragments do not single us out. They simply place us on the same curve. Rapid accumulation, accelerated knowledge, compressed time, the same early signs. Systems growing faster than understanding. power spreading wider. Then wisdom, and the same quiet question, emerges again, unspoken, unwritten, but felt. At what point does remembering become dangerous again? And if guidance returns, will it arrive as instruction or as silence? The tablets in this section, without conclusion, they move on, as if to say, the disagreement never ended. It simply continues through us. What the fragments turn toward now is not a new age, but a narrowing one. The later tablets become less detailed, less confident, not because the scribes knew less, but because certainty itself was becoming dangerous. They begin to describe humanity, not as a species progressing, but as a pattern accelerating. Time compresses. Centuries collapse into generations. Generations collapse into moments. What once unfolded slowly now happens all at once. The watchers observe this with a restraint that feels heavier than intervention ever did, because restraint requires patience, and patience is costly. The fragments suggest that something subtle changed after the last great collapse, not in technology, not in architecture, but in perception. Human awareness narrowed, attention shortened, memory externalized. Instead of remembering internally, humanity began storing memory outside itself, in stone, in text, in symbols. This preserved information, but weakened continuity. Knowledge survived, understanding fractured. This shift allowed civilizations to rise faster, but also to fall faster. Because when memory lives outside the self, it can be lost suddenly, burned, flooded, forgotten. The watchers who favored restraint saw this as inevitable. They believed humanity had chosen speed, and speed always demands cost. Those who favored guidance saw something else. They observed curiosity expanding, questioning accelerating, connections forming across distance. They believed intervention might still redirect the cycle, but the rules remain. No single age may be allowed to remember everything, because complete remembering leads to certainty, and certainty leads to control, and control leads to collapse. This is where the fragments begin to feel uncomfortably familiar. They describe an age where tools become abstract, where power is invisible, where influence travels faster than consequence, an age where humanity can alter its environment without understanding the full system. The tablets do not name this age. They do not need to. They simply describe the signs: acceleration, compression, fragmentation. The watchers respond, not with action, but with distance. Their presence recedes, almost completely, leaving behind only echoes, intuition, anxiety, a sense of approaching something already known. This is when ancient patterns begin resurfacing: interest in lost civilizations, obsession with cycles, a feeling that history is repeating, but faster. Humanity begins asking the same questions. Where did we come from? Have we been here before? Why do so many myths agree? The fragments describe this moment as a convergence, not of events, but of awareness, a point where forgetting can no longer keep pace with discovery. This is dangerous, not because knowledge is harmful, but because memory is incomplete. Humanity is remembering fragments without the surrounding context, tools without restraint, power without precedent. The watchers observe without intervening, not because they are absent, but because this stage cannot be guided. It must be chosen. The tablets suggest that this is always the final test, not survival, but balance. Can a civilization slow itself? Can it choose restraint without external enforcement? Can it remember enough to avoid repetition without remembering so much that it destabilizes itself? This question has never been answered successfully, at least not permanently. And this is where the fragments become quiet again, not abruptly, Gently, as if the scribes themselves felt the edge approaching. They stop explaining. They stop interpreting. They begin recording. Without commentary, observations, omissions, silences. Because commentary shapes memory, and memory shapes outcome. The final tablets do not predict collapse. They do not promise transcendence. They simply note that cycles do not announce themselves. They are recognized. Only in hindsight, the watchers remain divided, but less visibly. The disagreement becomes internalized, reflected now, within humanity itself. Some argue for expansion, others for caution. Some seek acceleration, others preservation. The same ancient tension, now playing out, inside a single species. This is not new. It is familiar, and familiarity is what makes it dangerous. Because familiarity creates confidence, and confidence precedes repetition. The fragments leave us here, not at an ending, but at a threshold, a place that has been reached before, where knowledge accumulates faster than wisdom, where systems grow complex, but brittle, where memory resurfaces. Without instruction, the tablets do not say, "What happens next?" They never do. They only ask the same question each time the cycle tightens. When remembering returns, will it arrive as understanding or as fear? And if guidance comes again, will it come as instruction or as silence? The fragments end without punctuation, as if the sentence is still unfolding, as if the outcome is not yet fixed. And perhaps, this time, the difference will not be in what we discover, but in whether we recognize the edge before stepping over it, or whether, once again, we will call it progress, and only later, call it memory. What the fragments begin to explore now is not collapse, but burden. They shift away from cities, away from floods, away from watchers, and turn inward, toward the cost of memory itself. The tablets suggest that remembering is not a passive act. It reshapes perception. It alters how time is felt. Those who remembered more experienced the world differently. They slept less. They spoke carefully. They hesitated. Because memory expands consequence. When you remember past collapses, every decision carries weight. This is why early priesthoods were not merely religious. They were custodians of memory, chosen not for devotion, but for restraint. The fragments describe initiations, not as revelations, but as limitations. Candidates were not shown everything. They were taught what not to pursue, which questions to abandon, which paths to leave unwalked. This is where later generations misunderstood secrecy. They assumed power was being hoarded, but the tablets suggest something else. Power was being delayed, because premature understanding had already destroyed worlds. The scribes write of ages, when memories spread too freely, when stories traveled without context, when fragments escaped containment. These periods are always followed by abrupt simplification. Languages flatten. Symbols replace explanations. Ritual replaces reasoning. This is not regression. It is compression. The watchers allowed this, even encouraged it, because compressed memory survives catastrophe. Detailed knowledge does not. This is why myth endures, where science disappears. A myth can pass through fire, through flood, through exile, unchanged in shape, even if misunderstood in meaning. The fragments linger here, patiently, as if they expect the listener to grow restless, to ask why so much was hidden. And this is where a quiet answer appears. Memory does not only preserve, it invites repetition. When humanity remembers how something was done, it attempts to do it again, without always remembering why it ended. This is the danger. The tablets describe a civilization long before Sumer, long before names, a culture that mastered alignment, not just with stars, but with cycles of collapse. They could predict when their own systems would become unstable, and they attempted to dismantle themselves gracefully, to descend deliberately, rather than fall. The fragments suggest this may be the origin of flood myths, not a single event, but many intentional endings. Civilizations choosing erasure over catastrophe, allowing memory to thin so that future iterations would not inherit the same fatal certainty. This choice required immense restraint, and it failed more often than it succeeded, because those who remember always believe they can manage what others could not. The Watchers observed this pattern with increasing distance, not because they disapproved, but because intervention creates distortion. When guidance becomes expected, responsibility dissolves. So they withdrew, not entirely, but enough, leaving behind only subtle markers, alignments, numbers, impossible accuracies that hint without explaining. The fragments describe these markers as anchors, points in reality, where memory can reattach, if discovered slowly, if approached with humility. This is why ancient sites feel heavy, why standing within them induces silence. They were designed not to teach, but to slow, to quiet thought, to stretch attention. The builders understood something modern humanity struggles with. Speed erodes wisdom. Acceleration collapses reflection. And reflection is where restraint lives. As ages pass, memory thins further. The priesthoods lose context. The rituals remain, performed without understanding, then abandoned, then rediscovered. Each rediscovery feels like revelation, but is always partial. The fragments never mock this. They observe, because repetition is not failure. It is structure. Humanity learns cyclically, not linearly, and each cycle reveals a little more, then forgets, then reveals again. This is not inefficiency. It is protection. The tablets hint that a fully linear civilization, one that remembers everything, without pause, would accelerate beyond control, burn itself out, collapse inward. This has happened before, enough times, to be encoded into the rules the Watchers follow. The Watchers themselves are not exempt. They too remember losses, failures, worlds that did not recover. This is why they disagree. Because memory informs strategy. Those who remember collapse prioritize restraint. Those who remember stagnation prioritize guidance. Neither is fully correct. Neither is fully wrong. And humanity exists between them, bearing the cost. As memory resurfaces in the modern age, the fragments grow increasingly cautious. They describe curiosity exploding, connections forming instantly, patterns recognized prematurely, humanity remembering tools without the long apprenticeship that once accompanied them. This creates imbalance, not because tools are dangerous, but because context is missing. The tablets compare this to waking suddenly from deep sleep, disoriented, alert, unprepared. The body moves before the mind understands. This is the current age, an age of remembered fragments, ancient questions resurfacing, old alignments rediscovered, but without the silence that once framed them. The Watchers do not intervene. Not yet. The fragments do not say why. They only imply that this stage must play out, because choice must emerge internally. If humanity slows itself, if it chooses restraint, if it remembers carefully, the cycle may soften. If not, forgetting will return, not as flood, not as fire, but as noise, distraction, fragmentation, memory buried beneath excess. The tablets do not mourn this. They record it, as they always have, patient, unemotional, waiting. And this is where this section ends, not with warning, but with observation. Humanity approaching another familiar density, where memory becomes heavy, where knowing more requires carrying more, and not all civilizations choose to carry it. What the fragments approach now is not an ending, but a thinning, a place where language begins to fail gently, where explanation feels intrusive. The last tablets do not attempt to guide. They observe. They record the sensation of standing very close to something already known, but not yet accepted. They describe this moment as a pause between breaths, a stillness that occurs, not after collapse, but before decision. Humanity, they suggest, has reached this place many times, but rarely recognized it, because recognition itself changes the outcome. To know you are at an edge is to slow, and slowing has never come naturally. The fragments turn again to consciousness, not as intelligence, but as capacity. Early humanity, they imply, did not think less. It thought wider. Awareness extended outward, into cycles, into seasons, into sky. Decision-making unfolded over long spans. Actions were weighed against memory, not personal, but collective. When that capacity narrowed, speed increased, individual focus sharpened, innovation accelerated, but foresight diminished. This narrowing was not accidental. It was adaptive, a way to survive in fragmented worlds. But adaptation becomes limitation when conditions change. The tablets hint that humanity now stands at a point where narrow awareness is no longer sufficient. Systems have grown too large, consequences too delayed, power too distributed to operate without expanded perception. This creates tension, not externally, internally, a restlessness, a sense of incompletion. This is why ancient memory resurfaces now, not as belief, but as curiosity. Lost civilizations draw attention. Cycles feel relevant. Old myths suddenly seem structural. The fragments emphasize this is not coincidence. It is timing. When systems reach a certain density, memory begins to leak through. Not fully, not safely, but insistently. Humanity feels this as anxiety, as nostalgia for something never personally experienced, as fascination with origins. The watchers observe without comment, not because they are absent, but because commentary would collapse choice. If guidance appears too clearly, the cycle repeats. Dependency returns. Responsibility dissolves. So they remain silent, allowing humanity to interpret, to misinterpret, to argue. This disagreement within humanity mirrors the ancient one. Expansion versus restraint. Acceleration versus balance. The fragments note that for the first time, these opposing impulses exist within the same global system. There is no outside, no untouched margin. This makes the moment unstable and rare. Previous cycles always had distance, a place to retreat, a place to forget safely. This time, forgetting is harder. Memory is stored everywhere, copied endlessly, but understanding remains uneven. The tablets suggest this is the most dangerous condition. Information without integration, memory without coherence, because fragments recombine in unpredictable ways. The watchers cannot intervene here, not because they choose not to, but because intervention would now be total. There is no partial correction, no localized reset, only global consequence. And so the responsibility rests entirely with humanity. The fragments do not say this as accusation. They state it as fact. The final inscriptions grow increasingly minimal. Short observations, gaps, silences, as if the scribes themselves felt the weight of continuing. They note changes in how time is perceived, how past and future feel closer, how cycles shorten, how repetition accelerates. They describe humanity reaching backward and forward simultaneously, recovering ancient questions while inventing unprecedented tools. This overlap has never occurred before, not at this scale. This is the unfamiliar element. The tablets cannot predict how it resolves, because prediction itself requires precedent. and there is none. The fragments end, not with prophecy, but with a final reflection. They suggest that collapse has never been the true danger. Collapse resets. Forgetting protects. The true danger is continuity without wisdom, memory without restraint, a civilization that remembers enough to repeat, but not enough to avoid. This is why the Watchers fear full remembering, not because humanity would become powerful, but because it might become certain, and certainty has always preceded collapse. The last lines are barely lines at all, more like impressions. They describe humanity standing at a shoreline, not of water, but of understanding. Behind us, countless cycles. Ahead, possibility. But possibility requires choice, and choice requires pause. The fragments do not urge. They do not warn. They simply ask the same quiet question, asked every time. The cycle tightens. When the memory returns, will it be carried with patience or grasped with urgency? And if this time there is no flood, no erasure, no enforced forgetting, will humanity learn to slow itself, or will speed once again decide? The tablets stop here, not because the story ends, but because it continues. Outside the record, in decision, in hesitation, in silence, and perhaps in the brief moment before sleep, when the mind loosens and memory moves freely, not as knowledge, but as recognition. And in that quiet space, the question remains unanswered, waiting. And even after the tablets fall silent, the sensation they describe does not end. It lingers, not as a thought, but as a pressure behind thought. The fragments imply that every cycle has a moment like this, a span of time where nothing dramatic happens, where no collapse announces itself, where no revelation arrives. Instead, there is waiting. Civilizations rarely recognize waiting as an event. They mistake it for stagnation, for emptiness, for lack. But the old accounts treat waiting as the most dangerous phase, because during waiting, choices are made quietly, habits solidify, assumptions harden, directions are set. Without declaration, the tablets suggest that this is when paths diverge, long before consequences become visible. A society does not collapse when its structures fall. It collapses when its attention becomes fragmented beyond repair. This is why the Watchers feared noise more than destruction. Noise scatters memory. Noise prevents integration. Noise makes repetition invisible. Fire can erase records, but silence can preserve meaning. Noise leaves everything intact and still destroys coherence. The fragments describe earlier ages, where collapse came not through flood or flame, but through excess stimulation. Too many signals, too many interpretations, too many partial truths competing for immediate action. In such ages, no single mistake causes the fall. Instead, the system exhausts itself. Every decision feels urgent. Every discovery feels final. Every disagreement feels existential. This is when restraint disappears, not because it is rejected, but because it is forgotten. The tablets never accuse. They never moralize. They simply note that attention is a finite resource. When attention fragments, wisdom thins. When wisdom thins, memory loses depth. And when memory loses depth, the cycle resets, not deliberately, automatically. The Watchers do not trigger this reset. They observe it. Their role, as preserved indirectly, is not to stop collapse, but to prevent permanent damage, to ensure that something survives. Not buildings, not technologies, patterns. The fragments suggest that patterns are the true inheritance. Stone erodes, metal rusts, but patterns migrate. They embed themselves in story, in instinct, in recurring questions that refuse to disappear. Why do civilizations rise so quickly now? Why do they feel fragile? Why does progress feel breathless? Why does the past keep pulling attention backward? These are not modern questions. They are ancient symptoms. The tablets imply that humanity has entered an age where memory is no longer scarce, but meaning is. Information persists indefinitely, but integration does not. This inversion has never existed before. Previous cycles forgot too much. This one may forget how to forget. And forgetting, paradoxically, has always been a form of protection. Without forgetting, there is no pause. Without pause, there is no choice. The Watchers cannot act here, not because they are powerless, but because any action now would override agency completely. So they do what they have always done. At this stage, they wait, and waiting, as the fragments emphasize repeatedly, is not neutral. Waiting amplifies intention. Whatever a civilization values during waiting becomes its trajectory. If it values speed, speed accelerates. If it values control, control hardens. If it values patience, cycles soften. This is why the tablets end without instruction. Instruction would bias outcome. They offer only awareness, a sense that something familiar is approaching, not an event, a recognition. The same recognition felt by scribes who knew they were copying remnants, by survivors who knew they were rebuilding echoes, by teachers who withdrew before their lessons became commandments. The fragments suggest that perhaps this is the only freedom a civilization ever truly has. Not the freedom to avoid collapse, but the freedom to recognize where it stands within the pattern. And recognition, even without certainty, can change how the next step is taken. The tablets do not say whether humanity will choose differently. They have never said that. They only preserve the space where choice becomes possible, and then they stop, not because there is nothing left to record, but because recording beyond this point would interfere. So the silence that follows is intentional, a pause, an opening, the same opening that exists now, between acceleration and restraint, between remembering and repeating. The fragments leave us here, not as an ending, but as a held breath. And in that held breath, there is no command, no prophecy, no reassurance, only the quiet awareness that this moment has occurred before, and that this time, for the first time, it may be recognized before it passes, and whether recognition will be enough remains unwritten.